Good evening. I'm the Greg Dobbs, he's the Ambassador Ross. Before we begin, a little story. In the last hour, as most of you were probably casually making your way to this program, Ambassador Ross and I were racing from the Vail airport to make it on time at 6 o'clock. The night before last, I got an email that said he was already on a tight schedule. He's leaving back for Washington, where he started the morning. He's leaving tomorrow on a 7:30 a.m. flight from Eagle to Denver to D.C. But I got this email the night before last saying, have to adjust the flight schedule and get in a little later, namely 4:33 this afternoon, because he had been asked to provide a high-level briefing to senior administration officials. So that briefing was this morning in Washington, and he's here with us now. And just in case you think he had a lot of time to relax, last weekend he flew to Greece for what's called Track 2 diplomacy, which means behind-the-scenes diplomacy that often yields better results than diplomacy for public consumption. And just to put the icing on the cake, between then and now, he also went to New York for an appearance before the Council on Foreign Relations on Tuesday. So he's racking up the frequent flyer miles.
Well, how else do you get global service standing?
Oh, he's got it in. Sometimes they invite him to fly the plane. But what you can take from that is that he is on top of the Middle East. He is totally on top of the Middle East. He has actually, that raises a question. And I haven't introduced you yet, and I want to get to that in a moment, but first the question.
He can do this because what you don't realize is he's known me since I was 8 years old.
Roughly.
Yeah. So,
I was only 6.
Yeah.
I'll tell that story.
No, I thought you were in the womb, but that's okay.
He is on top of the Middle East, and my question is, how hard is it for anybody these days with the dangerously fluid situation on the ground in Gaza, in Israel, in the broader Middle East, to stay on top of anything right now?
The reality is obviously complicated and complex. That kind of goes without saying. But if you sort of live this for as long as I've lived it, it's not that hard to stay on top of it. First of all, I mean, all these issues, it's like, it's the equivalent of me breathing. I know them, not because I'm so smart, but because I've done it forever. So that's number one. Number two, I go to the region all the time. I was there until a couple of weeks ago. And I like to say, when I was our negotiator, they had to listen to me and they had to see me. Now they choose to see me, and they can choose to listen to me or not listen to me. But because of that, it allows one to be in a position where you really have a kind of continuing access to what's being thought about. Because everyone out there right now is feeling, not surprisingly, an enormous amount of stress, they're also much more open to possible ideas that they're not hearing otherwise.
Because they want desperately to make something happen.
Yes. And that's in this situation that looks, not only complicated but really bad, there is a level of desperation on all sides right now. Whatever they say publicly, the public rhetoric masks what is a level of desperation to find a way out of this. He
knows all that because he has tried to make peace in the Middle East for 40 years, and sometimes he has come very, very close. But for the immovable forces on which I reported for many years from the area, the immovable forces that are the Middle East. But he served under 4 presidents, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. He was the chief Middle East envoy, which means chief Middle East negotiator at the very highest levels under 3 presidents. And what that means is unlike many diplomats, I don't know if you agree or disagree and you don't have to say, but unlike many diplomats who don't really understand the region, and I say that also from firsthand experience, he does. He has had for 40 years and still does his boots on the ground. That means he has understood each side's grievances and understood each side's goals. Dennis mentioned that we've known each other for a long time. How many of you heard him, 5 or so years ago when he spoke for the first time to Vail Symposium? Okay, most of you did not. Those who do might vaguely remember that I mentioned our very long relationship. I don't know if you were just 8, maybe almost 13, but we've known each other since we were teenagers anyway. It's hard to believe that looking at us now we were ever teenagers, but we were. And the reason for that was that in 1965, Dennis's older sister married my older brother. That's pretty cool. That's when I first learned, by the way, that you had great things ahead of you. At the wedding reception, it was his time to speak, 14 or 15 years old, and the MC called Ambassador Ross to the microphone. Do you remember that?
Oh, vividly.
But now he is back at our microphone for the second time. And he's currently the Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and still, as you already heard, integrally involved in the diplomacy of the Middle East. And maybe that's a good place to start, Dennis, because here's a little backstory. Not even quite 3 months into the war, I got in touch with Dennis and asked if he would be kind enough to come back to Vail and speak to the symposium again. He had a terribly busy schedule because of everything that was going on in the Middle East, but found a date in very early March. We set the date, it was even publicized, and then almost at the last minute, kind of like his earlier flight today, he had to cancel because he was called to return yet again for track 2 diplomacy to the Middle East. So we set it instead for tonight. And here's the first question. How different do you think that program would have been back in early March, given all the changes, all the unpredictable turns and twists in the Middle East? How different would that program have been in early March from this program in mid-July?
The surprising thing is it probably would not have been as different as you might think. The only thing that's different, I think, now is there's a higher sense of, well, I used the word desperation before, to try to find a way out of this. In March, there was not. That's the one difference. But, this October 7th was already, almost 6 months, removed from March. So the trauma of October 7th was still quite prominent, and I want to come back to that in a minute. The level of destruction in Gaza was quite high. The pressures that Israel was feeling both inside and the outside, again, quite dominant. Some of the dissonance within Israel wasn't quite as pronounced as it is right now in terms of the current government. On the Arab side, there was increasing pressure to find a way to get this done, to get it over. The administration's level of patience with Bibi Netanyahu was probably a little higher then than it is now, but not dramatically so. So the one thing I would say is different is that there are some Arab states, and we can talk about this, that are prepared to do more in Gaza if the war can be brought to an end than they were prepared to do at that point. One of the things that has to happen is you need to have the war end in a way where the Israelis feel they can get out. Even Netanyahu and his government, there's some dissonance there, but he understands very clearly Israel can't stay in Gaza. You can't have Hamas fill the vacuum in Gaza. So if Hamas can't be in control of Gaza, and Israel can't be in control of Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority is too weak, too corrupt, to lacking in decent governance.
That is the official government of the Palestinian population in the West Bank, the other territory.
And on top of all that, they can't come in on the back of Israeli tanks. So there's an understanding that there has to be some kind of transitional arrangement or administration. In March, you didn't have any Arab states who were prepared to play that role. Today, you have a couple of Arab states that are prepared to play that role. Still has to be sorted out, but that's probably the main difference between today and March. The irony is that today, it's a little easier to see what could be a next phase, or what could be a transitional phase, and what could be an end to the war.
Does Israel still feel, does Netanyahu still feel that he must, however you define the word, win?
For a long time he was saying we have to have total victory. And I've written a few articles where I said total victory is not an objective, it's a slogan. What he needs, you break it down and say, okay, what does a win mean for Israel? What does a win mean? What a win means is that Gaza can never again be a platform for attacks against Israel. What a win means is that Hamas cannot reconstitute itself as a military. What a win means is that there will be a different governance in Gaza. And what a win means is that you take the conclusion of this and you might be able to turn it into something much more dramatic with a Saudi normalization deal with Israel. And I can explain how those fit together. All that would be a clear win.
But you just said that it means, amongst other things, among several things, that Gaza cannot be a platform anymore for an attack on Israel. And yet, we've seen in the last month or so, the Israeli army has had to return to parts of northern Gaza where they'd already done what they considered a sweep, already done what they considered the eradication of the military arm of Gaza, and yet they've had to go back in.
Right. Because the nature of their approach had a fundamental failing. Because Bibi Netanyahu has what I call a couple of Messianic nationalists in his coalition, Ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. They actually have their own strategy, which is they want Israel to stay in Gaza. They want to see Palestinians in Gaza leave. And that's a strategy. And they've said, if he creates an outcome in Gaza where he's creating the Palestinian Authority being back in Gaza, that they'll leave the government. So he understands Israel can't stay, so he doesn't accept that. But he also understands that someone has to fill the vacuum. He's trying to, for a long time, he's tried basically to do it by saying, well, there can be local Palestinians disconnected from the Palestinian Authority. The problem is, any such Palestinians like that are going to lack any credibility or legitimacy. So we're at a point, basically, where he has resisted the idea of having different Palestinians under the rubric of the Palestinian Authority emerge. I think we've moved to the point where he understands, okay, maybe they don't have the label of Palestinian Authority, but they might be functional Palestinian Authority, and there's a transition to them. What I'm saying, in effect, is that I think he understands that he has to redefine what victory is. That by saying total victory, and in a sense, to be fair, given what happened on October 7th, which is the worst day in Israel's history, you think about it, every war that Israel's fought, other than its war of independence, every war that Israel's fought has been on Arab territory, not on Israel's territory. There hasn't been a single war where basically Arab armies were able to invade Israel itself. Israel was fighting on their territory, not theirs.
There have been the intifadas where they fought basically two wars with the Palestinians within Israeli and West Bank territory.
But they weren't, it wasn't a military.
Yeah.
It was acts of terror. This was a military onslaught.
Yeah.
3,000 Hamas come across the border. They come across in balloons. They come across in pickup trucks with heavy mounted machine guns. They came with incendiary grenades. When they went into these kibbutzim in the south, they came with incendiary grenades. The express purpose was to burn people alive. This was an onslaught The aim was to kill as many people as possible. And one of the great paradoxes is, who are the people who lived down in these kibbutzim? They were the peaceniks in Israel. These were the Shalom Akshav, peace now people. These were the people who would take Palestinians from Gaza, take them to doctor's appointments in Israel. And so these were the people who were the targets, because Hamas doesn't accept coexistence with Israel. You basically had 1,200 people die that day, plus 250 people taken as hostages. This was Israel pre-1967. The argument about occupation, the world doesn't say this is occupied territory, but Hamas views it as occupied territory. So this was an onslaught, and so it's not a surprise that the initial language was, having faced something Israel had never faced before, having seen a devastation, the images, the level of death and destruction, the sexual assaults. They took hostages. They took a hostage as young as 9 months old, and one as old as 85. So pretty hard in response to that, not to have very strong language. So total victory, you can kind of understand. The problem is he kept that as his language for several months. And what he should have started to do was he should have started to define, okay, what does victory mean? And what victory means is what I was just saying. Gaza can never again be a platform for attacks. Hamas is not in control. And you make sure that Hamas can never be rebuilt.
I read something you wrote. Actually, since the wedding, I've read everything you wrote. You said...
I apologize.
Modern wars rarely end in surrender. Is surrender by any side even in the cards?
No. Hamas will not surrender. And even though they've been dramatically weakened, they will not surrender. Yahya Sinwar is the leader of Hamas in Gaza. I used to deal with, I probably spent more time with Arafat than anybody, and there were times when we would have difficult meetings, and he'd get angry at me, and he would say, I'm ready to be a martyr for the cause. And I would say to him, nah, I don't think so. But Sinwar is ready to be a martyr for the cause. This is a guy who sees himself in historic terms. He sees himself as the new Salah ad-Din. This is a guy who feels he's already made an imprint now because of what happened on October 7th. And he would die before he would surrender.
Not to turn the corner too sharply, but because you raised Arafat and how much time you spent with Arafat, would you mind telling, you remember the funny little story, you know what I'm talking about, with your mom?
Yeah. So in 1995, we were on the brink of closing what was the most important deal we did in the 1990s with the Palestinians and Israelis. It was called the Interim Agreement. And the Interim Agreement was significant because it basically created the Palestinian Authority and brought it not only to Gaza, where it had been, we created that in 1994, but it brought it to the West Bank. And it brought it to all the cities in the West Bank. And it was creating basically the rudiments of a state. So we were closing on this, and it was highly controversial in Israel because this is the kind of religious heartland. I mean, Tel Aviv never existed. You read the Torah, Tel Aviv didn't exist. Tel Aviv is a 20th century city, basically built because of, interesting enough, separation starting in 1920. So the West Bank, Beit El, Hebron, Bethlehem, I mean, these all have historic places in the Torah. So it was very controversial in Israel, and we're very close to closing it. And I'm home, and Arafat calls me. One of my kids gets the phone.
You're home in Bethesda?
In Bethesda. And one of my kids gets the phone and answers, and it's Arafat calling, and so...
Have your kids ever called you and said, Arafat's on the phone?
So one of them yells out, he's really sad, he says, Yasser Arafat's on the phone. Okay. So I get on the, my mother, who Greg knew very well. My mother was visiting. She happened to be downstairs. And we were at a crunch point, and so I was, let's just say, I wasn't real subtle in the conversation on the phone, and there are times when you have to make points, and it's fair. I was yelling at him. And I was yelling what he had to do, and that he was, he was trying to say what he could do and what he couldn't do, and I said, I was not subtle in terms of explaining what was necessary if there was going to be an agreement. So this went on for maybe 25, 30 minutes, and when I got off the phone, my mother walks in and she says, "Who are you talking to?" And I said, "Yasser Arafat." And she goes, "You talk to him that way?"
These days, particularly obviously since October 7th, it's not even likely that the two sides would ever, in the immediate future anyway, meet face to face at all, or even directly through an emissary like you. Do you agree that with all the hostility higher on every side of this equation, that the chance of peace, it's a very general question obviously, is farther away than ever if they hate each other more than they used to?
Yeah, no, look, I think in a lot of ways, we've gone from being on the brink at one point, it's been a while, but we were on the brink in the year 2000 of an agreement. We were actually quite close, and unfortunately Arafat said no. All of his negotiators wanted to say yes. In fact, I was having dinner about 2 years ago. There's a city in the West Bank called Rawabi, a city that every Israeli should see because it's really a middle-class city. It's built to show a different kind of future for Palestinians. And I was having dinner with two of the former negotiators on the Palestinian side, and they were recounting a story that they hadn't told me before, I hadn't heard, which was the day we presented the Clinton parameters, which was December 22nd, 2000. These were an American bridging proposal. I won't get into why we did it other than to say that we had brought both sides to Bolling Air Force Base to try to lead to a conclusion. It had come after a meeting I had had with Arafat in which I had laid out to him what I said the Israelis could do, and I asked him the question, can you accept it? And he said yes. I had this meeting in Rabat, Morocco, and when I briefed Clinton on a secure line, he asked me why I wasn't more enthusiastic, and I said, because I don't believe him. Because I think it's easy for him to say yes to me when we're sitting one-on-one. But I agree we have to test it. So we brought both teams to Bolling Air Force Base, and after 3 days, the leaders of the two delegations came to me and said, look, we can't do this we can't reach an agreement. We need you to present a proposal. And that's what the Clinton proposal was. It was a bridging proposal. And what they told me was after we presented the proposal, the Palestinian team made a decision that they shouldn't brief anybody in Ramallah. They should go back as a group, and they should present this to Arafat with strength in numbers.
And Ramallah is the capital of the Palestinian West Bank.
In the West Bank, yeah. And the idea was as a group, if they went in to see Arafat, they'd have more weight, and they wanted to say we should accept this. So one of the junior members of the group was being called from a guy named Yasser Abdel-Rabo, who I knew well, who had been a negotiator. He hadn't made the trip with the group because his brother had died, but he wanted to know what was going on, and so again, everyone in the group had agreed we're not going to brief any details. So he wasn't briefed any details, but he was told we're going to recommend to accept it. And Yasser actually was a decent guy, but one of the things that Arafat did, Arafat cultivated competition around him. The way he basically ensured that he was not only the only decision maker, but everybody curried for his favor, was to create a constant rivalry and competition.
It's Machiavellian.
Very much so.
Yeah.
But by having everybody compete with each other, he was the one person they all had to be loyal to. So Yasser Rabo goes in and he says, I don't know the details, but they're going to come and they're going to recommend you accept it. And then, because everybody is always a better negotiator when they're not there. When you're never at the table, you're always a better negotiator. So he says, if I had gone, I'm sure I could have done better. So Arafat draws his own kind of conclusion from this. And when the group walks in and they're all ready to convince him, before they can say anything, he said, "You're all a bunch of national betrayers."
National betrayers.
Betrayers. And they melted. And these guys said to me, "Can you imagine where we would have been if we said yes?" All right? Now, then I tell the story because we really were that close to reaching an agreement. And today I would say, in many ways, it's like going back to 1948. It's like you're going back to the existential nature of this conflict because of the level of disbelief on both sides. Understand where we are now. For Israelis, it's still October 7th. Let me repeat that. For Israelis, it's still October 7th. Why? First, because the hostages. When you're in Israel now, life is deceptively normal, unless you're in the north or you're in the south. But everywhere you go, you see the pictures of the hostages. Everywhere. Doesn't matter. I don't care what city, what town you're in. Everywhere you go. So the reality of the hostages makes this October 7th. The reality that there's never been an explanation, not for the surprise. People kind of understand, okay, we were surprised. What they don't understand is, why was the IDF so completely unprepared? Not just surprised, but it took them the better part of a day. This assault began at 6:30 in the morning. And the earliest you had an organized military presence was 1:30 in the afternoon. Israel's not a big country. And the public doesn't understand what happened. And even when they got down there, it was not organized. So, there were the people who were there and individuals, small groups of soldiers went down on their own. Retired generals went down on their own. There's a fantastic story, if you want to, I can get into it if you want, of a 62-year-old former retired general whose son calls him from being in a safe room in Kfar Aza, and actually in Nahal Oz. And he says, we're in the safe room, and we've got terrorists all around us, don't know what's going on outside, don't know how long we'll survive. And his father, 62-year general, says, turn off your phone, don't do anything, stay there, be as quiet as possible, I'm coming to save you. And he did. There was a level of heroism of the people. You had these local security teams in each of these in each of the kibbutzim, in each of the kibbutzes, that numbered anywhere from 10 to 12, and they would be fighting 300 or 400 people who were more heavily armed than they were. The level of heroism is amazing, but the army wasn't there.
Against those odds, do you know how the general was able to save his son and others?
Yes, because what happened was he recruited people as he drove down. In a couple of cases where there were soldiers who had been wounded, again, who came in small units on their own and were ambushed, he made sure they were taken care of, and he recruited people as he came along. And they went in. The level of death and destruction would have been much greater. Moreover, there was nothing to block the Hamas fighters from going to their 2 air bases in the south, including where all the F-35s, like $2 billion a pop, were. They intended to get there. And it was the resistance of the people who were fighting on their own, not the military, that prevented that. But the military, it took the better part of a day to get there, and there's been no explanation for that. Moreover,
to this day.
To this day. This week, for the first time, there was a review of what happened at Kibbutz Be'eri. There was a review of only one, and it recounted all the mistakes that were made. Now, this is just one site. So, in effect, the absence, the hostages, the absence of an explanation, and most importantly, no accountability. Worst day in Israel's history, no accountability. No accountability of the military leadership, no accountability of the political leadership. That makes this still October 7th, and October 7th remains a trauma. But on the Palestinian side, you also have a trauma because of the level of death and destruction. Someone suffering from trauma is aware of their own pain and is incapable of feeling anybody else's. So we have two parallel traumas today. And that inability to relate to the other takes us back to any pre-peace process effort. And what it means is we can't go from where we are to a resolution. We're going to have to build a process that goes through stages. Now, I still think it can be done. I think it has to be done. When I went to New York Tuesday night, it was to argue against those who think you can't have a two-state outcome. And the problem with it,
who argue you cannot.
you cannot. And the problem is we have two national movements competing for the same space. These two national movements have distinctive national identities. Those national identities are deeply rooted in the land. There is an attachment to the land on each side that is emotional, historical, psychological, cultural. They will never coexist in one state. So if you say to me there can't be two states, then what you're saying to me is we're going to have one state where they can't coexist and they'll have a forever war.
But with the levels of hostility and animus, how can you have two states side by side?
So what you have to do, well, you may be talking more about a divorce, not a marriage, and you may be talking, hopefully, an amiable divorce. But yeah, you're talking about a divorce, you're talking about separation. You're talking about a process that will have to take some time. You're talking about having to reestablish functional cooperation so that each side stops demonizing the other.
Which they long had more than most people realize.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to say to people, if you saw the way the negotiators were with each other, they built bonds. And I'll tell a story because it's really indicative. So the head of the Israeli delegation was a guy named Oded Iran. The head of the Palestinian delegation was a guy named Saab Erekat. And we were at Bolling Air Force Base at one point. This was actually before the end. It was about 6 months before the end. It was before we went to Camp David. And Saab got sick. And all right, so I arranged to have the flight surgeon at Bolling Air Force see him, Oded, who had been the number 2 in the Israeli embassy in Washington and knew everybody and had a very close friend, a very prominent Jewish doctor. He said to me, "No way is he seeing the flight surgeon here. I will take him to my doctor." I said, "Well, look, you don't really have to do it." He says, "What do you mean I don't have to do it? I have to do that." So he takes him to his doctor. About 2 weeks later, he comes to me and he says, "You've been ignoring Saab." I said, "Yeah, I've been ignoring him." He said, "You can't do that." I said, "I'm ignoring him because everything he does is negative. And he has to see you don't get rewarded for negative behavior." He said, "Okay, but he can be more positive if you stop ignoring him." And I'm saying, look, this is a choice. You think you know him? I think I know him. You know, he needs to know I'm not paying attention to him until his behavior changed. And he says, "I have a suggestion for you." And Oded, by the way, I was quite close to him personally. He was our babysitter he was our midnight to 7 babysitter for when our second child was born, and we had to go to the hospital. He knew Debbie very well, my wife Debbie, and so he says to me, "You know what? I have an idea. Why don't you invite us for dinner, the two of us, and when dinner's over, I'll go in and help Debbie with the kitchen, with the dishes, and you take him out on your deck and just talk to him one-on-one." So I said, "Okay." And I did it, and he was dramatically more responsive after that. Okay? So here, they built relationships, and they were close to each other. And it shows that this is possible, but we have a lot of repair work to do.
So diplomacy is built as much, if not even more, on relationships than on, a good roadmap to a solution?
Yeah. Look, you invest in diplomacy. A, it's never instant. B, it depends on a level of trust. It doesn't depend on agreement. People who think that diplomacy is about indirection, they don't understand negotiations. You never get ahead by creating false impressions. You never get ahead by papering over differences. Because the one thing that happens in a negotiation, if you paper over a difference, sooner or later it will explode. And you will be seen as having misled somebody. Then they feel betrayed. Then they don't trust you at all. In these kind of negotiations, you build trust by being consistent. You build trust by being straight. You don't do anybody a favor by misleading them. I used to always say, part of my responsibility was to tell each side what they didn't want to hear. The hardest thing as a mediator is that what you're doing is you basically have to tell each side how they have to adjust. I will tell you two things that are hard as a mediator. One, you have to get each side to realize that if they want their needs to be addressed, they have to address the other side's needs. And you can never rush into that, because the minute you start talking about the other side's needs, they're all from the me generation. Well, what about me? What about me? What about my needs? So I used to spend endless amounts of time having them explain to me what they needed and why, and where it came from and why. And in the end, I could repeat it back to them better than they gave it to me. Not because I'm so smart, but because I heard it so often. I would have been an idiot not to be able to do it. But I would go over and over and over, and finally I'd get to the point where I'd say, okay, I would summarize, all right, here are your needs. And I go A, B, C, D, and here's why these are your needs. And they go nod and say, yeah, that's right. I said, okay, so if we're going to get those addressed, we're going to have to address the other side's needs. And the minute I would start on the other side's needs, they'd say, well, wait, but what about my needs? You would eventually get them to the point where they would say, okay. So that took time and that was hard. The other thing that's hard is beyond getting them to be aware that they have to address the other side's needs if they want theirs addressed. The other thing they have to come to grips with, which is hard, is their needs can be addressed but not their wants. There's a gap between what they actually need and what they want.
How does that apply today on the ground there?
Today, I would say, on the Israeli side, you were not going to be able to ensure that there is no Hamas presence whatsoever in Gaza. Okay? You want Hamas out of the picture completely. Now, the only way they could be out of the picture completely is if you could actually eradicate them. But you can't. If you could, that would be a different story. Since you can't, whatever is going to emerge here, there's still going to be a factor here. And your own acknowledgement that you're prepared to try to reach a deal with them means you accept there's still a factor of some sort. So your want is they're not a factor at all. And we can share that they can't be a factor that shapes things. But we cannot produce an outcome, because you can't produce the outcome, where they're not a factor at all. Creating a reality where they can't really shape events, that's your need, and that's what we have to work towards. But for us to say, and for you to say, they're not going to be a factor at all, not realistic. That's your want, it's not your need. Now on the Palestinian side, the want is the Israelis to be completely out of there, and they will be out of there except for a buffer. And why do they need a buffer? Even though Gaza is small. And I have to say, my initial feeling before I went there, I've been to the south twice. My initial feeling was, okay, Gaza is small, Israel has to withdraw 100%. When I went down there and I was in Kfar Aza, and 500 yards away with nothing between Israel is Beit Hanun. This is where there's nothing to block them from coming. No way do people go back to that kibbutz if there's nothing in between them and Beit Hanun. No way. It doesn't mean over time you can't phase that out. There'll be an Israeli withdrawal. As part of a deal, there will be an Israeli withdrawal. But it will not be from everything in Gaza. It'll be, in the end, it'll be from Rafah, which is the border between Egypt and Gaza. The Netzarim corridor, which sort of divides northern Gaza from southern Gaza, they'll be out of that as well. They'll be out of all the urban areas, but they will not be out of the area right along the border. And honestly, they shouldn't be, until Palestinians can prove that there is no threat there. So each side is going to have to accept what the Palestinians need is Israel is effectively out of Gaza. But what they want is for there to be no Israeli presence at all. That won't happen.
That gives rise to a question about the reports we've been hearing or reading for months now about a ceasefire, which would then lead to other, comparatively speaking, good things. Where does that stand? It seems to teeter back and forth on small debating points.
We are probably as close to it as at any point that we've been. I want to take a little bit of time to explain the evolution and also why, in a sense, there was some backtracking and now why it looks somewhat more promising. In February, Hamas agreed to a three-phase process for a hostage deal. Each phase would be 42 days. At that time, they made a concession that was a significant concession. They said, while we want to see a permanent ceasefire, we will not make a permanent ceasefire a condition for starting this process. So the first phase, which is 42 days, can begin without a commitment to a permanent ceasefire. Okay? That was a significant concession, and it increased the prospect of being able to do this. They walked that concession back in May, and they said, no three-phase process without a preamble, a commitment, a guaranteed commitment to a permanent ceasefire before we start the first phase. A complete walk back from where they were. And what the Israelis did when President Biden on May 31st gave his speech, he was taking what was an Israeli proposal, and it had moved significantly in two respects. First, they took what had been Hamas language. Hamas had presented a counter-proposal, but it was based on the pre-existing precondition of a permanent ceasefire before anything happens. You have to commit to end this permanently before any hostage gets released. What the Israelis did, when this was stuck for a few weeks, they came back and they took the whole language, and for the first time, they created a linkage between the first phase and the second phase. So on day 16 of the first phase, you would begin negotiations on a permanent ceasefire. If you didn't reach an agreement by the end of the first phase, you would continue those negotiations into the second phase. So what the Israelis were doing is they were basically adopting a position that basically said, one thing you'll know for sure is you'll have 3 months of a ceasefire. Now, what's happened now is the Hamas has backed off, gone back to the position they had in February. And the main issues right now that are being sorted out are, does Israel maintain a position on the Rafah-Philadelphia corridor? This is the Egyptian...
That's the Egyptian border.
Gaza border. This is significant because this is where Hamas got all of its materials. Understand, there are 300 miles of tunnels. 300 miles of tunnels. I've spent a lot of time in Gaza. Gaza is an impoverished place. Imagine 300 miles of tunnels. I've been in the tunnels. I was in a tunnel big enough where you could drive a car. I was in a tunnel where there was air conditioning and a pipe along the top. The amount of cement that has been used to build 300 miles of tunnels, you can imagine what it could have been used to build on the surface. the piping, the wiring, the steel, the metal, the wood. They built, the Israelis call it the metro system, they built an underground city. By the way, an underground city where none of the Palestinian public can go. You know, I've had people say to me, well, look at the gap in death and destruction. I said, well, you know, the Israelis actually build shelters for their citizens, and Hamas exposes their citizens. They don't let Palestinians in the tunnels, other than their fighters and their weapons. They deliberately expose their public in a very conscious way, because they think the more Palestinians who die, the greater the pressure is on Israel. There isn't the slightest concern for what are the consequences for their own citizens. I like to say, you know, Hamas treats their public not as human shields, but as martyrs. But they never ask the Palestinians of Gaza, do they want to be martyrs?
From the get-go, you've been supportive. I mean, I read what you wrote in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, and spoke to the Council on Foreign Relations and on different television talk shows. You were very supportive. Has anything in your thinking changed since the beginning, given the levels that you were just referred to, the levels of death and destruction in Gaza, the way, in other words, Israel has prosecuted the war?
Well, look, if you go back to the first New York Times piece I wrote, I had one fundamental condition the Israelis did not live up to. I said in that piece, normally I would have favored a ceasefire, but not this time, because I didn't want to validate the Hamas strategy. If you'd had an early ceasefire, then Hamas would have looked like they had a colossal victory. Their notion of how you deal with Israel would have been validated. The ideology would have been given an enormous boost. It was that would have been a tragic mistake for the Middle East. Now, having said that, at the same time, I said, but Israel has to demonstrate this is about going after Hamas and not punishing Palestinians. It means Israel has to go out of its way to maximize the amount of humanitarian assistance that can go in. I wrote this in October, and I said Israel needs to do that because the only way it can create the time and space to do what is necessary militarily is to show it's doing everything it can to minimize the death and destruction for Palestinians.
But that is not what we've seen.
No, it's not what we saw, and it reflects two things. One, there was great pressure. This was not, by the way, this was not just Bibi Netanyahu. To be fair, again, the entire Israeli public, including people I've known, people who were left-wingers, said, why should we be giving humanitarian assistance? They hold hostages. They deny the Red Cross any access to them. They treat them in an inhumane way. The videos that were shown of large numbers of Palestinians cheering as hostages were brought in on October 7th, the Israelis saw all that. And so the public mood in Israel was, why should we be giving humanitarian assistance to them, especially if Hamas ends up diverting it? And you can understand the emotion. The problem was it ignored that they didn't exist in a vacuum. And that you couldn't sustain this as the rest of the world saw increasing death and destruction. So number one, that was a big mistake. Number two, the nature of the way the Israelis started the war. The military had no plan. They had no plan. This is not something they expected. They thought this is what Hezbollah might do from Lebanon. I was I was in Israel 3 months before. And I was in the north and I was in the south. Everything I heard from the military was, Gaza's not a problem. We know Sinwar. He has a prisoner's mentality. He doesn't want a war. He'll create pressures as a way of getting us to give him...
Sinwar, just in case you don't know, he's the, military
He was the head of,
on the ground in Gaza.
In Gaza. And he's the head of something called the Izzadim al-Qassam Brigades, the military wing of Hamas. And they said, we know Sinwar. He spent 23 years in Israeli jails. He's fluent in Hebrew. And they viewed him as someone who, as a prisoner's mentality, he manipulates certain pressure like to get rewards. Like the prisoners, maybe they go on a strike to get more visitation rights or more exercise time or better food. And this is how they described him. And they said the threat for them was in the north, not in Gaza. They didn't have a plan. It wasn't just that they were surprised. It wasn't just that they were not organized to deal with it. They didn't have a plan because they never anticipated anything like this in the south. So the first couple of weeks, the nature of what they were doing was, it wasn't vengeance, but it was, okay, this time our objectives are different. This time our objectives are to root Hamas out. The kind of targets we wouldn't have hit before because of the civilian casualties or consequences. This time, because the objective is different, we'll hit everything. And they spent the first couple of weeks hitting everything. A different strategy from the beginning would have made more sense. And then a fundamentally different strategy when this is what you referred to before. They cleared out Gaza City. That's their first target. And there was a reason for it. It's where the lion's share of the Hamas military units were.
And rockets were coming from.
Yes. So there was a logic to that, although there was also a logic, and I asked about it, why aren't you going to Rafah? Because that's their oxygen. That's where they get everything. Gaza may have been an open-air prison for the people who lived there, but it wasn't for Hamas. They got whatever they needed. So they were doing Gaza City, and then they left. And they had no strategy for what would take their place. That's why they backed there 4 times. The approach, and I had a discussion while I was there in December. I said, well, it makes sense for you to sort of clear areas and gradually have these areas become increasingly off limits to Hamas. Build them up, and then you begin to show the Gazans that Hamas can't come back. You have increasing areas where Hamas doesn't come back. That changes the attitude of the Gazans. And this, again, I think, was the victim of Netanyahu being worried about the opposition of the far right within the coalition. So one of the things that's changed in Israel is the military leadership. There's a gap between where the military leadership is and where the prime minister is. Because for a variety of reasons, the military feels we have all these tactical military achievements, but we can't turn them into strategic outcomes because we have to have something that comes next. There is an evolution now. Again, where we are today, there's more of a move in that direction than there was before.
I could happily stand here all night listening to you. I would have to ask for a chair, but I could. However, I'm mindful that you've probably got questions in the audience. I want to ask you, it would have to be fairly brief, about 3, for lack of a better word, complications. So one at a time. Hezbollah on Israel's northern border. They have been most of the time fighting a low-grade war, long before October 7th, and there have been bigger flare-ups, but basically it's been a low-grade war since then. What would it take for it to turn into a high-grade war?
First of all, neither side wants a high-grade war. Hassan Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah, if he wanted an all-out war, we would have had it already. And the Israelis understand, even though there's a segment and early on there was pressure from within the military to go all out. And the reason was Hezbollah is dramatically more capable than Hamas. Hezbollah also has tunnels, and Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets. And half those rockets can cover all of Israel and have a payload that can be quite destructive. They can saturate Israel's missile defense network, and Israel would have to go on the ground. This is something that would shut Israel down for at least a month. The consequence for Lebanon would be completely disastrous. So neither side actually wants it, number one. The problem is what you have is that since October 8th, Hezbollah has decided we will support Hamas, but within a confined area. So most of what they attack is in the area within 5 kilometers of the border. Mm-hmm. There have been a few attacks up to 10, and in one case beyond 10 kilometers. But otherwise, they signal with force by keeping it within confined areas. The Israelis, for the most part, answer the same way. There have been a few times the Israelis have gone deeper into Lebanon, hit targets, and in the last month, the Israelis took out very senior Hezbollah commanders, and every time they did, Hezbollah would answer with 200 rockets. Again, primarily within a confined area, but hitting within that confined area more spaces and with greater lethality. So the risk is that one or the other hits the wrong target. You know, the Israelis have evacuated the north, but 60,000 Israelis aren't there. There's about 90,000 Lebanese who aren't there. But you can hit the wrong target. And if you hit the wrong target, you could be off to the races. So even if neither side wants it, when you signal with the use of force this way, you run an inherent risk. So I'm uneasy about this because I know what this war looks like. I said before, you go to Israel today, if you're not in the north and you're not in the south, it is deceptively normal. It's not normal, but it's deceptively normal. If there's a war between Israel and Hezbollah, people will be in their bomb shelters for a month.
I think it's probably important for people to understand that Hezbollah is not just amassed in the southern 10 miles of Lebanon. When I was covering that long civil war in Beirut, they controlled the country all the way up to and including parts of Beirut.
Yes.
I mean, Hezbollah it has been and continues to be a major force. The second, I call them complications, is maybe even bigger, and that's Iran, which is the center, and call it the central figure, the father figure of the axis of resistance, which is Hezbollah, which is the Houthis, by the way, we haven't mentioned them, which is militant cells in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, and of course, Hamas. What would it take, in your opinion, for Iran to become more involved and not in a good way?
Yeah. You're right, they're called the axis of resistance. I actually call them the axis of misery. Because everyone who's a part of that, their publics are miserable, have no possibility, no hope. What would it take for them to become more involved? An all-out war with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the Iranian Foreign Legion. Hezbollah trains all these other militias. Everyone you were running through, the Houthis, in Iraq you have multiple militias, all trained by Hezbollah. Not just trained by Hezbollah. They have built in each of these places a military-industrial base. The Houthis, people look at it as ragtag, well, they're now able to produce their own drones. Why? Because Hezbollah came in and showed them. They produce their own missiles. Why? Because Hezbollah came in and showed them. They trained them, they showed them, they built it up. They have, as I said, 150,000 rockets. They're the insurance policy for Iran that Israel doesn't attack Iran's nuclear infrastructure. They've spent 40 years, probably half a trillion dollars on their nuclear infrastructure. And Israel couldn't do it as well as we could, but they could take out most of it. And the deterrent against that is 150,000 rockets. This is the only place they've successfully exported the revolution. So they will fight to the last of all their other proxies. You know, they wouldn't like to see Hamas disappear, but yeah, it's too bad. The Houthis, too bad. Hezbollah, no. Hezbollah is too important to them. So if we saw an all-out war, they will intervene to try to save Hezbollah. What they would do, why would they do it? It's not just to save them. They want to trigger external intervention to stop the war because the risk of what it means is so high. You know, right now, we've had a war going on. We have the Houthis shutting down a lot of the traffic. 57% of the traffic that goes through the Suez Canal has been cut back because of the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. Disaster for Egypt, by the way. But it also means that basically, you know, you would think that the price of oil would have shot up. Somehow it got baked into the cake. But if this explodes and you have what looks like a regional war, and it won't look like it will be, then the price of oil could shoot dramatically higher. And if that's the case, it won't just be the US that has an interest, China has an interest. The Russians don't, but the Chinese do. The world's biggest importer of oil, they don't want $200 barrel oil. They got their own problems economically right now. So they don't want to see that. So you will see an external intervention, but it'll take a couple of weeks before you could stop it.
Okay, the third thing, I know you told me that just a couple of weeks before all the travels I articulated in the last few weeks, you were in Israel, and before that, you were in what, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
Yep.
Right before the war, we were all watching as it appeared that Saudi Arabia and Israel were going to shake hands, at least informally, if not formally.
Yeah.
That, of course, came to an end with October 7th. Where is it now? How important are the Saudis in this whole equation?
The Saudis would still like to do the deal because they want a defense treaty with the United States. Why do they want a defense treaty with the United States? Because basically their preoccupation is what they call Vision 2030, which is the internal transformation of Saudi Arabia. We can get into how much it's been transformed. There's been a social revolution there. It's been guided by the desire to transform Saudi Arabia's economy to a 21st century economy, a non-oil derivative-driven economy, a digitally based economy. They'd like to be a lot like Israel as a startup nation. And they know if there's threats coming from the outside, that can be a diversion, a distraction, and make it difficult. But with a defense treaty with the United States, they see, okay, that creates an umbrella, a defense umbrella for us. Now, they know they can't get a defense treaty with the United States. You can't get it through the Senate unless you normalize with Israel. And they understand something else, courtesy of Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham, and I heard this because I was over there right after him, he went and told the Saudi leader, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, said to him, you can get it through with Biden as president because the Republicans will support this. Biden can convince the Democrats who have a negative view of Saudi Arabia and MBS, he can convince the Democrats to go ahead and do this. So MBS knows that as long as a Democrat, say Biden or a Democrat, is president, he can get the defense treaty. If Trump becomes president, he can't. Democrats will not support the defense treaty, even if there's normalization with Israel. So it's still very much alive for him. It's still very much alive for the Biden administration. The key is being able to end the war because from a Saudi perspective, and it shouldn't be surprising, the climate right now makes it hard for them to say, gee, we can go and we can normalize with Israel. They will still want a Palestinian component. They want to show that the Palestinian component, that they're doing this deal, produce something dramatically different for the Palestinians than anything we've seen before. And I can explain what that could look like. But so they want that, the Biden administration wants it, but you need to end this war. Now think about it. I want to just put this in additional perspective. On the night of April 13th, April 14th.
This year,
Iran fired 300 projectiles at Israel. 300. They were cruise missiles, drones, and ballistic missiles. 100 of the cruise missiles and drones were intercepted under the umbrella of the U.S. Central Command, U.S., UK, France, Jordan, with intelligence, early warning radar connections from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. 100 of those interceptions were not carried out by Israel. The idea of a regional coalition is not an abstraction. Mm-hmm. This is no longer a theory. Imagine how much harder it would have been for Israel if they had to be responsible for intercepting all 300 on their own. It would have spread their assets much more thinly. As it was, they performed flawlessly, but it would have been a whole lot harder if they hadn't had that. Now, getting the deal with the Saudis, it's not just normalization, it's also making it easier to take what is under the umbrella of the Central Command and expand the scope of this into a regional cooperation. Israel is facing a seven-front war right now. It's the ethos of we defend ourselves by ourselves, great ethos, but when you're facing seven fronts, you can use the help.
As if I don't have a dozen follow-up questions, I want to let you ask them.
Thank you. I can't fail to note that it took us 60 minutes to mention Iran. The true obstacle to peace in the Middle East is Iran. And I worry that there's too much focus on important but smaller things as opposed to the central opposition to peace, And then, of course, the allies that we can work with, we mentioned Saudi, but also Jordan, Egypt, and the Emirates. So can we please talk not just what the plan is, but is there a focus on the big problem as opposed to the smaller problems?
Look, it's a very fair point, because Iran doesn't cause these issues, but it exploits these issues. And it's created this axis. And unless one has a strategy to effectively deal with Iran, they will continue to exploit every conflict. So you have to have a strategy. You have to raise the cost to them in a way the costs have not been raised. And that applies not only to what they're doing with their proxies, it also applies to their nuclear program. They are, I've been saying, you know, if one of the things that President Biden said is that Iran was not going to get a nuclear weapon on his watch. I can tell you, if there was a second term, one of the first things he would have to do is bring his advisors together, because he's going to say, look, I said they're not going to get a nuclear weapon on my watch, and the truth is, given where they are in their nuclear program, they could. And by the way, the closer they get, even if they don't have it, it begins to create a shield behind which they can carry out coercion and intimidation, with a sense that nobody can actually attack them because of this. So we have to operate at two different levels. Whoever is going to be the next administration, there's going to have to be a strategy that raises the cost to Iran, that makes it unmistakable. I'm going to give a very brief advertisement for myself. I have a book that's coming out, but unfortunately it won't be out because this is the nature of the publishing process. The book is done, but it won't be out until the beginning of next year. The title is Statecraft 2.0, and I'm not going to give you a précis of the book, but there is one chapter, a 50-page chapter on what our policy towards Iran should be. One of the things I do is I go through every administration from the time of Jimmy Carter to today, look at what the approach to Iran has been, look at what has affected Iranian behavior. While the Islamic Republic never changes its fundamental stripes, it does make tactical adjustments. And I sort of explain the circumstances under which they make tactical adjustments, so that even if they're only tactical adjustments, sometimes tactical adjustments can have strategic consequence. And so I lay out the essence of which is, because they fear, the irony is, they fear direct confrontation with us because they see that threatening the regime. Regime survival is their first, second, third, and fourth priority. So the more they fear direct confrontation with us, the more we have to convince them their behaviors are increasing the risk of that. We, and it's not been one administration, by the way, we have a tendency to constantly say we don't want to escalate. We should never say that. Not because we want to escalate, but we want them to understand they're running the risk. We want them to fear escalation, not us. Again, you have to learn the lessons of the past. You have to look at what their behavior has been. We have got to shape an approach that plays on the fears that they have that are quite real. Because they're strong in terms of rhetoric, we have a tendency, ourselves, to take the words too seriously. Sometimes we have to be prepared to use comparable words, because they actually take our words seriously.
And there is maybe a wild card with Iran, very quickly, which is just last month they had a presidential election. And the winner was called a comparative moderate. Now, I spent a lot of time in Iran. I think that's a very relative term. He was more moderate than the man he beat, who was favored by the supreme leader, and any policy he wishes to enact can be overruled by the supreme leader. But that said, the wild card is maybe this guy sees some value in opening up to the world, in negotiating with people to whom they've turned a cold shoulder for a while. Who has the next question?
So next we're going to take one from our online audience.
Oh.
Politically, how long can Bibi survive? Who could replace him? And likewise, who comes after Abbas?
Simple questions. Look, in the case of Bibi, there are there are two issues right now that are going to put him in a position that increases the peril to the current coalition. First, there's the issue of the hostage deal. There are those in his coalition, I mentioned them before, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who say if he does the deal, they will leave the coalition. What's happening right now is that those who are doing the negotiations for him, who come out of the security establishment, the intelligence establishment, security establishment, are increasingly saying there is a deal that is possible, the one I was talking about. If Bibi does the deal, Ben-Gvir might bring the government down. However, there's a wild card here. The wild card is hard to bring a government down when the Knesset is in recess. And on July 28th, which is obviously not far away, the Knesset goes out for the summer recess and doesn't come back until November. So what it means is that he might be able to do this deal anyway, notwithstanding what Ben-Gvir is saying, and sort of postpone bringing it down. Now, if he doesn't do the deal, and the negotiators, and Nitzan alone is from the military, retired, very impressive retired major general. He's a negotiator. Ronan Bar, who's the head of Shin Bet, is one of the negotiators. David Barnea is the head of the delegation. He's the head of Mossad. If they come out and say there was a deal available and the prime minister wouldn't take it, I think that could create a real explosion within Israel.
Next.
So that I think could be, because I didn't answer Abbas.
Yeah, true.
What comes after him? See, as a negotiator, you have to listen very carefully. So
Obviously, I am not worthy. Abbas, for those who don't know, is the president of the long since elected and not re-elected president of the Palestinian Authority.
Elected in 2005 to a 5-year term. There's been no election since. So I often say, you know, a guy got elected for 5 years, and here he is 19 years later. So,
who do we all know who would like to have that?
Exactly.
Go ahead,
Yes,
and then we've got a question over here.
Following on that,
Finish on Abbas.
yeah. Look, anybody who says they know who's going to replace him is kidding you or kidding themselves. There's a deliberate effort not to have a successor. You know, one thing about what you very rarely see, since these aren't democracies, you very rarely see any Arab leader identify someone who could be a successor, because they think that successor might decide, why should I wait? So Abbas doesn't have a natural successor. But there are a lot of people waiting in the wings. There are people from their security establishment. There are people who are former security people. Jibril Rajoub used to head Palestinian Security Organization. He decided he would become much more popular if he headed their soccer federation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he is heading their soccer federation. He could be a possible successor. There's a nephew of Yasser Arafat who's estranged now from Abu Mazen, Nasser Kidwa. Because of the connection to Arafat, he could be a successor. There are people who are close to Abu Mazen who sort of manage a lot of things. There's a guy named Hussein al-Sheikh who would like to be a successor. My guess of what will happen were he to disappear from the scene tomorrow, you would have a collective leadership. He wears 3 hats. He's the president of the Palestinian Authority. He's the head of Fatah, which is the largest party in the PLO. And he is the head of the PLO. So the PA, Fatah, and the PLO. 3 hats. I suspect you'll have a collective leadership. 3 different people will wear those hats. Collective leaderships never end up being collective for very long. There'll be a competition there, and someone will emerge from that. But it'll be, the reason you'll have it early on is because the old Benjamin Franklin adage of we'll all hang separately if we don't hang together is likely to predominate in the near term.
Okay, over here.
Two questions. You can choose which to decide on. One is what to do with college students and what they're doing in terms of what they think is supporting Gaza. And the other thing is, what about the Bring Them Home Now movement? Is that helping at all, either the hostages and their families or Israel in general?
What was the second? I didn't quite get the second part of that.
There's the Bring Them Home Now movement.
Yeah.
Is that helpful? Should we continue our walks and our connecting with others?
And Dennis, we have to go fairly fast now.
Okay. Are we in the lightning round now?
Yeah.
Look, on the Bring Them Home Now, don't stop. Don't stop. You should emphasize it as much as possible. Look, there are 116 hostages, and the best guess right now is half of them are alive. Every day that goes by puts them at greater risk. And, you know, I used to say when Bibi was talking about total victory, one of the things I was saying, there's no total victory if the hostages who come back now don't come back alive. Don't stop. This is I speak to the hostage families all the time. Their lives stopped on October 7th. And what they have endured, none of us can imagine. And because they're imagining what their family members are enduring. So don't stop.
We're over here.
Thanks so much for this. It's been wonderful. I want to go back to what you said about sloganism, and I guess based on the vote, I think it was this week that the Knesset had about a two-state solution.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think a third of the people were there to take the vote.
Yeah.
And we're thinking also about the dissonance that's inside the country right now. Do you think that was sloganism or dissonance? I mean, how do we read that moving forward?
First of all, the issue of no Palestinian state for Israelis is a left-to-right issue right now, because they're convinced a Palestinian state will be led by Hamas. Now, does that mean the reason I was arguing on favor of against the argument that two states is not any longer viable, because I agreed up front, if you're asking me is it viable today, the answer is no. Does that mean it can never be viable? No, it can be viable. What does it take? It takes us to approach it differently. We have never created accountability on the Palestinian side. That has to happen. What I would like to see us do, and I'm keep pushing this, I'm not going to give it up, I want us to say, I want the administration to say, we recognize that the Palestinians are a people, and as a people they have a right to self-determination. And they can determine if self-determination is a state or a confederation, that's up to them. But with rights comes responsibilities. And before they can fulfill the right of self-determination, before they can have a state, they have to meet a number of benchmarks. Examples, I can give you a list of about 10, but I'll just give you a list of a few. One, their identity has to be shaped by coexistence, not armed resistance. That means they have to renounce armed resistance. They can't have a state if they're still emphasizing armed resistance. The identity of the Palestinians has to be sorted out because there's a conflict between what Hamas and other extremists represent and what, in theory, the Palestinian Authority and Fatah do. They say they favor two states, but you don't see them doing anything to socialize coexistence. They have to be seen as renouncing armed resistance and, in a sense, emphasizing coexistence. There can be no militias. Hamas is a militia. There can be no militia. You can't have a state if you're having separate militias. There has to be a change to their educational system. And by the way, one of the ideas I have is you bring the UAE. The UAE overhauled its entire educational system. The UAE actually has something called the Abrahamic Center. By the way, it's not about, it's a reflection of their education. They have a church, a mosque, and a synagogue there. You look at what they've done in terms of education. They create centers of excellence. The system that needs to be developed both in Gaza and in the West Bank needs to be an educational system that is revamped. The textbooks are rewritten. It needs to be revamped, both to make them, to create an education that allows Palestinians to compete in the 21st century, and that also emphasizes tolerance, coexistence, and basically, adopts a posture that is fundamentally different. That textbook there should be oversight of that. The point is, you can create a series of benchmarks, and you can have a number of parties evaluating the progress they make, and they don't have a state before they meet each of these benchmarks. Then they will actually have earned a state. There should not be a kind of automaticity where they get a state. It's a big mistake for European countries to recognize the Palestinian state and require nothing of it.
I,
By the way, I should add one point. To be fair, if that's happening, you then can't have Israel taking steps on the ground to make a Palestinian state impossible, which, by the way, that's what Smotrich is trying to do.
So
And the ultra-conservative settlers in the West Bank.
we want to leave time for closing statements, but I got a lot of whispers through the audience, hoping we can quickly address the college students question.
Yeah, I didn't address that.
And how we're to interpret that, what can be done about that, how should we think through that, and then we'll have closing statements from Greg and Ambassador Ross.
What did I just emphasize on the Palestinian side? Education. I teach at Georgetown. In addition to that, I do about 15 campuses around the country a year. I'm trying to organize a number of people to do what I'm doing. Because you have people chanting on campuses, from the river to the sea. They don't know the river, they don't know the sea, and they don't know what's in between it. They have slogans without having the slightest clue. The people who give them the slogans, they know what they want. They want no Israel. These, by the way, they're not pro-Palestinians, they're pro-Hamas, which is unthinkable. Literally, it's unthinkable. Because Hamas is about rejection of two states. When people are out there favoring Hamas, they're about one state. They're about no Israel. And what's required is education. I want to give one example. With a colleague of mine, I spent 2 days going to the Claremont colleges. There's 5 colleges there. We spent 2 days doing 4 classes and 2 public events. Pomona was one of the 5. They have a big encampment, a Palestinian, pro-Palestinian encampment. And at the end of 2 days, the reality on that campus was different. Because students were actually, they didn't want to simply accept slogans. They wanted to know what was behind them. They wanted to be able to ask questions. And I don't go there. I go there as someone who spent, the reality is, 40 years. You were right, it's 40 years.
I know everything about you.
Yeah, you do. 40 years trying to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians and Arabs and Israelis. And that's what I went to talk about. I had a colleague, by the way, who's a Palestinian, who I know because he was a Palestinian negotiator. And we went there and we basically made this case. And the reaction of the students, I felt a little bit like the Pied Piper. We'd do these classes and we'd have students following us all over the campus. What it reflected was a genuine curiosity and not simply buying the slogans. So you ask me what's required? We need to organize much more systematically, having people who can go talk about this conflict on a fact basis, not a slogan basis, not an ideological basis, and explain. This conflict is not a morality play where one side is all right and the other is all wrong. Right? I said, these are 2 national movements competing for the same space. The reason in the end you need 2 states for 2 peoples is you will never satisfy this unless those 2 national identities in fact can be fulfilled.
So James asked for closing statements. I really shouldn't even bother to give it to Dennis, but I am going to anyway. After all the years I spent as a journalist covering the Middle East, I came away with the deepest sense of pessimism because I saw not just hostility, strong animus between the generations I was covering, but they were reflecting what they had heard from the generations before them. Their fathers had told them something that their fathers had told them, and they saw no way to live side by side. Many did, but many didn't see a way to live side by side. What I'm grateful for tonight, Dennis, is not that you've given us any certainty, because you can't. I'm not sure you would, that the two sides can live in peace, but you've told us that there, number one, are schemes to make it happen, and people trying to make it happen, and you're one of them, and I appreciate that.
Look, let me just pick up on what you're saying. I've often been asked, someone once said to my wife, boy, Dennis is really committed. I'm still committed. Said, he's really committed, and she joked and said, well, he probably ought to be. But I've often said, why should we give in to those who want us to give up? This is a conflict with real people. I'll close with this thought. I actually started as an arms control negotiator. And the thing about arms control is all an abstraction. I used to talk about, throw weights of missiles, the diameters of missiles, what kind of missiles can you remove so you create the theoretical notion of stability. So you can't disarm the other side. It's all abstract, it's all theory. And when I started negotiating on this is not theory, these are real people. And the people I dealt with, every one of them had lost somebody on each side. And I'm just not prepared to give up the idea that these are people who can never live in peace. I'm just not prepared to do that.
Ambassador Dennis Ross. Thank you.
Ambassador Dennis Ross and Greg Dobbs.